Welcome to another Photography Simplified video. My name is Chris, and in these videos, I do my best to simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take great photos. Today, we're talking all about bracketing and how you can use it to take stunning images of things like sunsets. Let's get into it. So, what is bracketing? There are certain situations where you have a very high dynamic range, meaning there's really bright areas of the scene, but there's also very dark areas of the scene. This happens in a sunset, for example. It can be hard to expose for the entire scene. You might be able to adjust your camera settings and get the sunset and the sky looking good and exposed well, but the ground and foreground is just completely dark. In contrast, you might change the camera settings and get the ground looking good, but the sky is completely blown out. This happens because we're dealing with such bright areas contrasting with such dark areas. This is where bracketing comes in handy. Bracketing allows us to take multiple images exposed for the different areas, either the highlights or shadows, and combine them to make one image exposed properly for all of the areas. If you find this video helpful, by the way, please leave a like and consider subscribing so you can see my other future beginner tutorials as well. There are different ways that you can bracket. One is to use an automatic setting available on most modern cameras called auto exposure bracketing, or AEB. With auto exposure bracketing, you can choose the number of images you want to take that you'll later combine. Typically this is 3, one overexposed to capture the darker shadow areas of the image, one underexposed to expose the highlights in the bright areas properly, and a normal exposure. In auto exposure bracketing, you can also set the exposure increments. In other words, how much darker or brighter will these additional images be? Let's look at an example using the camera. I have my camera here set up in the exact type of situation where you'd want to bracket. I have a bright sunset sky that I can expose well, or a darker foreground that I can expose well, but I cannot get both exposed properly in the same image, so I'm going to need to bracket. On my Canon camera, I'm going to shoot in aperture priority mode, and if I go to my EV meter and use the scroll, I can then set the increments of the darker and lighter images for my bracketing. I'm going to set them a little close to 2 stops darker and 2 stops brighter. When bracketing, I like to use the 2-second timer to avoid any camera shake. Let's take those 3 images. You'll see that I have one overexposed for the darker foreground, one underexposed for the brighter sky, and a normal exposure. I can then combine these 3 photos later to get my bracketed image. When bracketing, it's important to make sure that your images are aligned. I recommend using a tripod, and typically I use the 2-second timer to avoid any additional camera shake. This will make sure that my images are aligned and ready to be combined later. Outside of using auto exposure bracketing, you can also manually bracket your photos, meaning you put your camera into manual mode and you adjust the settings yourself to change the exposure for the different areas. Take the images and combine them later yourself. A good rule of when you should use bracketing is if you have your camera set up in manual mode, point it at your scene how you want, and you have to change typically your shutter speed to either make it darker or brighter over more than one stop, meaning you have your scene how you want. Maybe the foreground's a little too dark, so you make a longer shutter speed to brighten it. And if you have to do that until your light meter says you've gone over a full stop, then you most likely need to bracket. You can simply adjust the settings to get the sky exposed how you want, take a picture, adjust them to the foreground how you want, take a picture, and combine them later. Let's look at an example using the camera. In order to manually bracket an image, I can put my camera in manual mode, set the aperture that I want, the ISO that I want, and then simply change my shutter speed for the different exposures that I need. Let's make the shutter speed faster to capture all the highlights correctly in the sky, and take that image And now we can simply make the shutter speed slower to capture the detail in the shadows of the foreground and take that image. We'll be able to combine these later. If you're finding this video helpful, there may be more helpful content in my book, Photography Simplified.
If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information.
Now that we've discussed how to take bracketed images, let's look at an example of how we combine these images later when editing. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to combine them using Adobe Lightroom. Other products have options as well that will let you combine images in a similar way.
To start, I have my bracketed images here on the bottom. This first image is my normal exposure. Then I have my underexposed image for the brighter areas of the sky, and my overexposed image for the darker areas of the foreground. I can select all of them by holding Shift, and once I have all three images selected, I can right-click, do Photo Merge, HDR Merge. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. Lightroom's going to generate a preview, and don't worry if your sky still looks a little blown out or the foreground still looks a little dark. There's typically more data in this image than you'll see just in the brief preview that it creates. On the right, there's a couple settings. The first is to auto align. I would usually leave this checked. This will just make sure that your three images are lined up. If you shot on a tripod, this shouldn't be that big of a deal, but leaving this check can help to make sure that everything's lined up correctly. Next is apply auto settings. If you check this box, Lightroom will apply its own edit based off of what the image needs. I typically leave it unchecked because I like to edit my own photos, but if you want a good starting point, this can be a great box to keep checked. Last is apply HDR. I typically don't use this. I don't love the HDR look. It doesn't look as realistic to me, so I'll just leave that unchecked. And finally, this de-ghost amount. You might be wondering what that is, but basically if something is moving through your frame, say I had an airplane flying fast through the sky, as I take my three different images, that is going to move, and the de-ghost just helps to eliminate any weirdness caused by something moving through the frame. So you can always toggle this if you need it higher or lower. For the most part, I usually don't even have to touch it. So I'm just going to leave that there, and I'm going to hit merge to merge my three photos. Okay, now here is my merged photo. Now the nice thing about using bracketed images is you can see if I bring my highlights down, maybe even the exposure a little bit, that there's still a lot of good detail in my sky and color as well. And similarly, if I bring up the shadows, there's a lot of detail in the foreground. And now I'm able to capture a scene that in one image I couldn't expose properly for both. However, now I'm able to. Now let's look at another example of when I manually did bracketing. So here's my darker image for the sky and my lighter image for the foreground. When I did this manually, I changed my shutter speed and I only did it twice. One image for the sky and one for the foreground. But we'll combine them in the same way. I'm going to select them both, right click, Photo Merge, HDR Merge. Okay, and then I'm going to hit merge. Now, it merged that photo, and similarly, we can see that if I decrease the highlights a little bit, maybe even up my exposure, and then up my shadows, that I have a lot more detail than if I were to have just taken this image, a single exposure, without bracketing. I'll edit both of these up and show some examples right after this. Okay, these were some very quick edits, but here you can see the final result. This image is the 3 shots that were combined, and you can see that the bracketing allowed me to get a great foreground and sky exposed well, allowing me to see the scene more as it was to my natural eyes. And here is the image where I did just the 2 manual brackets together. And once again, you can see that the sky and the foreground are exposed well and look more like it would to our natural eye.
Another reason you might want to use bracketing is just to give yourself more options. Sometimes when you're out shooting, you may not always expose or capture the scene exactly how you want it. If you put your camera into continuous shooting mode, meaning when you push down the shutter button, it just continues to take images, it will take the several images at the different exposure increments, giving you more options later when you review your images to see which exposure of your scene you like the best. Let's look at an example with the camera.
If you're hoping to use bracketing to give you better chances of properly exposing a scene, you can simply set the increment levels of the brackets you want. So I have mine set at about 1 stop lighter and darker. And then I'm going to put the camera into continuous shooting mode. Now, when I point at my subject, I can simply push down the shutter button, hold it down, and the camera will take the 3 images exposed differently. Now I can review the 3, and hopefully one of them has a good exposure of the scene that I'm capturing.
I hope that this video has helped you to understand bracketing better. Now, get out and take some great photos.